Hey everyone, this is a piece. Um, it is from 1962. It's by an H. Schurer, and it's titled "Reflections on Rosa Luxemburg and the Bolshevik Revolution." So here we go. Rosa Luxemburg's essay on the Bolshevik Revolution, which she wrote in September and October 1918, was published posthumously in 1922. Luxemburg's critique of Bolshevism has often been quoted, and her championship of liberty and democracy and detestation of terrorism have been contrasted time and again with Bolshevik practice. A closer examination of some aspects of this critique may contribute to an understanding of the world of ideas which generated both the Bolshevik Revolution and Rosa Luxemburg's criticisms of the Bolshevik Revolution. One of the decisive events in Russian history was Lenin's arrival in Petrograd in April 1917, when Lenin confronted the Bolshevik Party with a new program which amounted to Lenin's acceptance of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, elaborated in 1906. As Trotsky always emphasized, Rosa Luxemburg had been favorably disposed towards this theory in the years immediately following the Russian Revolution in 1905. It was in Luxemburg's Polish journal in 1909 that Trotsky had contrasted Trotsky's own perspective for the future Russian Revolution with those of Menshevism and Bolshevism, of which Trotsky had denounced as attempts to constrict the coming Russian Revolution within the bounds of capitalist democracy. The most controversial and sensational part of Trotsky's perspective was the boldness with which Trotsky forecast that the democratic revolution would grow into a socialist revolution in a backward country like Russia in one uninterrupted process before the advent of socialism in the advanced countries of Western Europe. Like Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky stood firmly by the Engels-Kautsky synthesis of Marxism, which regarded the transition to socialism as an inevitable development and the advanced countries as its predestined leaders in the long run. But Trotsky added to the Engels-Kautsky synthesis of Marxism the idea that the process might start in a marginal area like Russia and give political impetus to the main upheaval, which would center on Germany and the other advanced countries of the West. In a joint essay written in 1850, Marx and Engels had discussed England's position in relation to the continent and the relative political impact of economic crises on an industrially advanced England and an industrially backward continent. What happened on the continent merely reflected the state of development in England. Quote, "It is in England," they said, quote, "that the basic trend is at work." That, quote, "the basic trend is at work. England is the demiurge of the bourgeois cosmos," end quote. Marx and Engels continued, quote, "While economic crises produce political revolutions on the continent first, the basis for this phenomenon is still in England. Violent eruptions are bound to occur in the extremities of the bourgeois organism earlier than they occur in the bourgeois organism's heart. For in the heart, the counterbalancing tendencies are more powerful." End quote. Marx and Engels. If England's relation to the continent in 1850 is compared with Germany's relation to Russia in 1917, the parallel, the spread of, quote, "violent eruptions," end quote, from the extremities to the heart, is clear. What happened in Russia merely reflected the conditions of Germany and had to be judged in these terms. To the Trotsky-Luxemburg school, the Russian Revolution only made sense if interpreted in this manner. One aspect of Trotsky's theory, which has received little attention, was Trotsky's insistence that the spread of world revolution from world revolution's Russian, quote, "extremity" to world revolution's German, quote, "heart" would be impeded by the innate organizational conservatism of German social democracy. But Trotsky was convinced that the pressure from the rank and file would sweep this obstacle away. When Trotsky first advanced this view in 1906, German social democracy was still regarded everywhere as the leading revolutionary force in the world. But Trotsky adhered to his belief that in the great political crises to come, the leadership of a mass organization like German social democracy would find it hard to change its tactics and would have to be pushed into the correct revolutionary path by pressure from the rank and file. This juxtaposition of a conservative party bureaucracy and a revolutionary rank and file was to be one of the main themes of the writings of both Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg. The idea of permanent revolution itself rested in part on a belief in the spontaneous character of the upheaval in Western Europe, which would be sparked off by the Great Leap Forward in Russia. The rank and file would drive the leaders forward and overcome the organizational conservatism of the Western mass parties. This makes it clear why Trotsky saw no reason to revise his basic assumption even after the 4th of August 1914, when the image of German social democracy as Europe's leading internationalist revolutionary force had suddenly to be replaced by the reality of a patriotic party cooperating loyally with a semi-autocratic government in support of the German war effort. Trotsky's view continued to be that once the, quote, eastern extremity of the bourgeois organism, end quote, had given impetus to the socialist revolution, the, quote, logic of events, end quote, would push the German working class into the path of revolution. German social democracy's change of front in August 1914 had naturally affected the issue, but at the same time the war had created so many new factors favorable to revolution that his basic conception needed no revision. For Rosa Luxemburg, on the other hand, the trauma of the 4th of August 1914 was rather more profound and brought a radical change in her approach to the prospective Russian Revolution. Luxemburg continued to believe in the, quote, Russian aspect of permanent revolution, that is, in the possibility of the leap in Russia from autocracy to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But the, quote, German aspect, end quote, of the theory had altered. Rosa Luxemburg had now begun to doubt whether the impetus radiating from the East would really be powerful enough to sweep away the obstacle of the German social democratic organization, which had shown itself, since the 4th of August 1914, to be a far more conservative body than even Trotsky could have imagined in 1906, as Luxemburg considered the German and the Russian revolutions to be an indivisible whole. Luxemburg was rendered very pessimistic about the prospects of the Russian Revolution by the failure of the German working class to follow a revolutionary socialist policy during the war. In Luxemburg's first comments on these prospects after the February Revolution in Russia, Luxemburg went out of her way to castigate Trotsky for restating the traditional doctrine that in the transition to socialism, the advanced countries would lead and the backward ones follow. Trotsky had even declared point blank that backward Russia was not right for the dictatorship of the proletariat. This Rosa Luxemburg angrily and specifically rejected, since Luxemburg still accepted Trotsky's assessment. But at the same time, Luxemburg was extremely skeptical about the permanent establishment of proletarian rule in Russia in view of the cooperative and thoroughly unrevolutionary attitude of German social democracy and the, quote, slumbering international towards their own imperialist governments. During the months between the February and October revolutions, the Spartacist publications viewed the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia as inevitable. They represented what was happening as a forward march of the urban working class supported by the peasants and were confident that the liberal bourgeoisie would cede the proletariat political power. Now that a Soviet had power in Petrograd, Rosa Luxemburg believed that Russia's war against Germany had become a genuine war of defense. One second. Now that a Soviet had power in Petrograd, Rosa Luxemburg believed that Russia's war against Germany had become a genuine war of defense. The hypocritical German social democratic slogan, quote, liberty against czarist autocracy, end quote, of August 1914 was now true, with the roles of Russia and Germany reversed. Though the quintessence of the Bolshevik Revolution was to be that a minority group took power by conspiracy in the best Blanqui style, in opposition to all other socialist currents, Rosa Luxemburg's writings during these decisive months never even mentioned the differences between Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, and right and left socialist revolutionaries. If the dictatorship of the proletariat were established, it would be by the sweeping to power of the working class supported by the peasantry. This is how Trotsky himself had visualized the permanent revolution in 1906, when it meant an elemental force breaking down all obstacles, not a theory inspiring a group of conspirators to impose their will on a majority which happened to be disunited. In spite of the trauma of August 1914, Rosa Luxemburg also held firmly to the old Engels-Kautsky synthesis which had always underlain Trotsky's conception, and which implied that, wherever the initial impetus might come from, the main burden of European progress would still have to be shouldered by the German working class. Would events in Russia help or hinder the cause of the German Revolution? This was the criterion by which Rosa Luxemburg continued to judge them until her death. What Trotsky could not possibly have foreseen in 1906 was that the backward and the advanced countries of Trotsky's model would be at war when the great historic leap took place in October 1917, and that the leap itself would be made in conjunction with a war which had been more or less lost. The fact that Germany and Russia were locked in combat, that Russia was revolutionary, and that the German working class was passively supporting the German ruling class created, in Rosa Luxemburg's eyes, a situation which could hardly have been worse for the prospects of European socialism. But Russia's backwardness as such never colored Rosa Luxemburg's thoughts. What concerned Rosa Luxemburg most was the isolation of Russia's revolution. The military weakening of Russia by the revolution would mean the strengthening of German imperialism and the postponement of the German Revolution. In May 1917, Rosa Luxemburg clearly recognized that while the, quote, bourgeois liberal tendencies, end quote, of the Russian Revolution would be used by the Western Allies, its, quote, proletarian socialist peace, end quote, tendencies would be welcomed by the German ruling classes. Isolation was the factor which would be detrimental to Russian socialism. Isolation would create an impossible situation. In August 1917, Spartacus declared the war-peace capitalism-socialism dilemma in Russia to be insoluble as long as the Russian working class remained isolated. Quote, whatever course the Russian proletariat follows, it is condemned to follow the wrong line. By fighting for a general peace, the Russian proletariat only tightens the cord round its own neck, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. Spartacus. I don't think it's, that's Spartacus. So I'm assuming Rosa Luxemburg had something to do with that, but I don't think it was her specific statement. At least that's not what I'm seeing here. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. As early as May 1917, Rosa Luxemburg had recoiled with horror from the idea of a separate Russian peace with Germany. Such a peace, Spartacus declared in August 1917, would strengthen Germany and thus be a betrayal of the international working class, who say it would be handed over to German imperialism. The ambivalence between the image of the heroic revolutionary masses, who pushed the bureaucratic leaders forward on even aside, and the reality of a working class loyally prepared to serve the German semi-absolutist regime in the hope of winning a few political and economic benefits after a German military victory, colored Rosa Luxemburg's thought very deeply. What affected Luxemburg most was the international aspect of the theory of permanent revolution, with its implicit assumption that the revolution would spread to the West. Thus, Luxemburg's first reaction to the news of the October Revolution was inspired by the profoundest skepticism about the prospects of Lenin's coup. Luxemburg never expected the Bolshevik Revolution to succeed for a moment. Though contemptuously brushing aside Kautsky's argument that Russia was too backward for the dictatorship of the proletariat, Luxemburg insisted that the root of the coming debacle of the Bolsheviks, of which Luxemburg was convinced, lay in the cowardice of Western social democracy. In other words, the word profoundly modified the original conception of permanent revolution. At the same time, Luxemburg considered the October coup to have been worth making, even if the October coup was nothing more than a heroic gesture doomed to certain failure. Footnote: Rosa Luxemburg to Matilda Wurm, 15th of November 1917. And Rosa Luxemburg to Louisa Kautsky, 24th of November 1917. End footnote. In 1906, Trotsky had confidently prophesied that the seizure of power by the proletariat in Russia could drive the German masses to break down the German masses' party's, quote, organizational conservatism, end quote. But there was a world of difference between the German Social Democratic Party of 1906, which had just declared in favor of the political mass strike as a new weapon of political action, and the German Social Democratic Party of 1917. Conditions had changed so completely that in order to be effective, the spontaneous revolutionary action of the masses would have to have 10 times the autochthonous energy and be based on completely independent thinking. The German Social Democratic leadership not only suffered from organizational conservatism and needed a thorough shaking up from below, but would be determined, at all cost, either to prevent a spontaneous uprising of the masses or channel that spontaneous uprising as soon as possible in the direction of liberal democracy, and would oppose the introduction of, quote, socialism in our time, end quote, as premature and adventurous. The one tiny spark of spontaneous revolution in Germany to which Lenin could point when urging his party to undertake the armed October Rising was a loosening of discipline in the German Navy, which may have proved disquieting to the German authorities, but which no experienced observer could really have interpreted as a prelude to the proletarian revolution on a grand scale. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks were naturally in no position to evaluate these events at all soberly. Rosa Luxemburg, on the other hand, was more realistic about the prospects of a German revolution. Luxemburg saw far more clearly than either Lenin or Trotsky the tremendous change wrought by August 1914. While Luxemburg enthusiastically acknowledged Bolshevik audacity and energy, Luxemburg saw the Russian Revolution, even after October 1917, as Trotsky had seen it in 1906, as the spark which was to ignite the West European powder magazine. The main burden of the transition to socialism will be borne by the advanced countries of the West, while the, quote, eastern extremity of the bourgeois world, end quote, will initiate the, quote, catalytic first strike, end quote, to use contemporary terminology. Thus, when the October coup was followed almost immediately by a clash between the Bolshevik regime's need to maintain the Bolshevik regime's self against Imperial Germany and the interest of socialist revolution in Imperial Germany, Rosa Luxemburg resolutely took the line that the interest of world revolution and the German Revolution were more important than a possible defeat of Bolshevism. This was the essence of the struggle over the question of a separate Bolshevik peace with Germany on German annexationist terms. In April 1917, Lenin had made an abrupt change of front by suddenly dropping many of the Bolshevik traditions and forcing the Trotskyite heresy down the reluctant throats of his followers. Similarly, at the end of 1917, Lenin had suddenly confronted his party with a defeatist line and a demand for an immediate separate peace on Germany's terms, after previously urging a revolutionary war if Germany presented the Bolsheviks with any demand for an annexationist peace. The doctrine of a revolutionary war had been accepted as official Bolshevik policy, and the Stockholm Bolsheviks, who represented the party abroad, had used it in their propaganda towards the German working class in which Rosa Luxemburg's followers collaborated. Footnote: see Proclamation of the Foreign Bureau of the Bolshevik Central Committee of the 11th of November, 1917. Published in Bota der Russischen Revolution, numbers 9 to 10, Stockholm, 17th of November, 1917. End footnote. In in this in view of this, it is no wonder that the overwhelming majority of the Bolshevik leadership was at first against Lenin. Rosa Luxemburg also viewed the Bolshevik surrender at Brest-Litovsk in a highly critical spirit. Spartacus could only excuse the surrender of the tactics of part of the International Socialist Army left in the lurch by the main body. It was no wonder that the effects of its action were the opposite of what it had intended, and that its policy was the opposite of socialism. The only result of the Bolshevik peace policy would be to strengthen Imperial Germany. In September 1918, Rosa Luxemburg was to write, quote, Lenin and his friends, did not consider that the Russian capitulation at Brest-Litovsk would mean an enormous strengthening of the imperialist pan-German policy, and thus a weakening of the chances of a revolution in Germany. Not the end of the war with Germany, but only the beginning of a new chapter of that war. End quote. Rosa Luxemburg, Spartacus Briefe. I guess it's Spartacus letters. In their desperate situation, the Bolsheviks did not hesitate to accept the services of Parvis, formerly a radical left-winger and now a German patriot, whom they had hitherto treated as a renegade, but whom they were now prepared to use as an intermediary between themselves and German social democracy. All possible means had to be tried to put pressure on the German imperial government from within. Scheidemann also came to Stockholm and discussed the situation with Radek and Vorovsky. Though, like Parvis, Scheidemann had previously been an arch-traitor, the detested, quote, social patriot of Bolshevik and Spartacist denunciation. Spartacus had only been able, just a side note while I'm thinking of it, I'm pretty sure that Rosa Luxemburg hated Karl Radek, and I'm pretty sure that Theodor Liebknecht thinks that Karl Radek had something to do with ratting out his brother, had something to do with Karl Liebknecht's murder. He thinks that, believe he thought that Karl Radek had given away Liebknecht's address to the German authorities or something like that. I don't know if that's ever been verified or not, but I have heard that theory. Anyway, Spartacus had only just been able to accept that the Bolsheviks had been forced to negotiate with the imperial authorities, but the acknowledgement of Scheidemann and Scheidemann's like as the official leaders of the German working class in consequence of these negotiations, and the attempt to use their influence as a means of pressure, proved too much for a revolutionary group, which owed that revolutionary group's existence to the denunciation of the Scheidemanns as arch-traitors to the socialist cause. The Bolsheviks obviously clung to the hope that the social democratic parties of Germany and Austria would oppose a dictated peace, and now regarded the detested, quote, social patriots of yesterday as useful pressure groups in their own desperate struggle for survival. Trotsky even demanded that he should be allowed to go to Vienna to see Victor Adler, for whom no abuse had been too bad in the past. In a letter to Lenin, Trotsky also expressed the hope that the German Social Democrats would break with the imperial government over the annexationist peace proposals. Footnote, see J.W. Wheeler Bennett, Brest-Litovsk, London, 1938. End footnote. Thus, the strengthening of Germany by the Bolshevik tactics of capitulation went hand in hand with Bolshevik attempts to enlist the cooperation of the official social democratic parties of Germany and Austria in opposing the harshness of the German terms. In these circumstances, it is not surprising that Franz Mehring, Rosa Luxemburg's close friend in the Spartacus League, should have bitterly attacked the Brest-Litovsk policy of the Bolsheviks even though Franz Mehring made every allowance for their difficult situation. Franz Mehring wrote in a New Year article on the last day of 1917, quote, the crime with which the Russian Revolution may be committing, quote, the crime which the Russian Revolution may be committing by the Russian Revolution's separate peace with the Central Powers, ... it will have to atone for, end quote. Published in Leipziger Volkszeitung, 31st of December 1917, quoted in J. Schleifstein's book Franz Mehring, published in Berlin, 1959. And footnote. Contradictions between the interests of Western revolutionary parties or groups linked to Russian communism by bonds of sympathy and the self-preservation of international interests of Soviet Russia were to become a standard feature of international communist history in the years to come. But the anxious months of late 1917 and early 1918 saw the contradictions between the new opportunist realpolitik of victorious Bolshevism and the aspirations of the nascent German Communist Party come to a head for the first time. It cannot be doubted that Rosa Luxemburg took as the main criterion for all her judgments the effect which any policy produced on the development of socialist revolution in Western Europe. In a collection of documents on the impact of the Russian Revolution on Germany, which has recently appeared in East Germany, Luxemburg is now taken severely to task for this approach. Quote, she saw everything exclusively from the point of view of the German Revolution, without considering the same problem from the point of view of the Bolsheviks and of the Russian Revolution, end quote, complains an exponent of the present official brand of communist historiography in an introduction which denounces Rosa Luxemburg's views on Brest-Litovsk as grave errors. Footnote, see L. Stern, Die Auswirkungen der großen sozialistischen Oktoberrevolution auf Deutschland, 4 volumes, Berlin, 1959. End footnote. Bolshevik Russia's dual policy of combining reliance on future world revolution with an attempt to play off the two belligerent groups against each other caused Rosa Luxemburg and her followers continuous worry. In September 1918, the rumors of a definite German-Russian rapprochement struck Luxemburg like a thunderbolt. While Luxemburg again showed understanding of the difficulties which beset Bolshevism and Bolshevism's isolation from the main forces of the slumbering, quote, dog-like international working class in the advanced countries, Luxemburg considered that its accommodation to the realities of the world was going too far and was trampling underfoot all the ideals in whose name the revolution had been carried out. Luxemburg believed that it was isolation which was dooming the revolution and forcing the Bolsheviks to carry out a wrong policy. But the moral aspects had also to be considered. Any alliance between Germany and Russia would extinguish the moral light which had so far come from Russia, where the Bolsheviks alone had kept to the principles of socialism. The Bolshevik realpolitik of making terms with Imperial Germany, Luxemburg was still unaware of the return of the two powers to secret diplomacy in August 1918, was also short-sighted as well as indefensible on grounds of socialist morality. Any Soviet-German alliance would lead in the end to extinction of the Soviet regime by the far more powerful Germany, and if this took place, all the sacrifices would have been in vain. Moral bankruptcy would be the result. Quote, the political defeat of the Bolsheviks in straightforward struggle against superior forces in an unfavorable situation would be preferable to this moral catastrophe, end quote. Luxemburg, The Russian Tragedy, published in Spartacus Letter number 11, September 1918. I've been meaning to read that piece. Maybe this will inspire me to read it sooner. And footnote, the material which has come to light since Luxemburg expressed this horror at the thought of a possible Soviet-German alliance has uncovered many more aspects of the dual policy in which Luxemburg would have found much additional ammunition for her criticism of Bolshevik behavior. Footnote, For recently published material on this phase of Soviet-German relations, see G. Freund, Unholy Alliance, published in 1957. See also Z.A.B. Zeman, edited volume Germany and the Revolution in Russia, published in London in 1958. End footnote. New section. Section 2. At the end of September 1918, Rosa Luxemburg drew up the balance sheet of the first year of the Bolshevik Revolution in a manuscript which was left unpublished at that time. At the time. Footnote. Rosa Luxemburg, Die Russische Revolution, published in Berlin in 1922, with an introduction by Paul Levy, who had broken with German communism in 1921. I don't know it'll be up first, but I have a little biography of Paul Levy, as well as his piece, his introduction to Rosa Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution, coming up on this channel. So if you're interested, you want to check that out. End footnote. Rosa Luxemburg could look back over a period during which Luxemburg had accepted the October Revolution without reservations and had brushed aside Kautsky's criticisms and Kautsky's arguments that the Bolshevik Revolution, or the October Revolution, was criminal folly to carry out. Jesus Christ, I fucked that sentence up. Luxemburg could look back over a period during which Luxemburg had accepted the October Revolution without reservations and had brushed aside Kautsky's criticisms and Kautsky's arguments that it was criminal folly to carry out a socialist revolution in a backward country. On the other hand, in the great Brest-Litovsk debate between the advocates of revolutionary war and protagonists of a separate peace on Germany's terms, Luxemburg had been an outspoken critic of Lenin's line. Like the, quote, left communist, Luxemburg had based her ideas on the paramount importance of world revolution as opposed to the self-preservation of Bolshevik Russia. Luxemburg's Polish followers living at the time in Russia had all taken the, quote, left communist line. End quote. The, quote, left communist line. Footnote. See M.K. Dziewanowski, The Communist Party of Poland, published in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1959. End footnote. Luxemburg's fundamental conception of the socialist revolution had remained the same as before. Luxemburg looked on Russia as part and parcel of the advanced capitalist countries of the West. Even if it was merely a hinterland of European capitalism, Russia's recent history only made sense if it was regarded in this way, as Parvus and Trotsky had been the first to indicate, and not if it was considered in isolation, as Kautsky had considered it in 1917. The Russian Revolution had to be treated not as a freak of history arising out of a unique and unrepeatable set of circumstances, but as a phenomenon on a national scale within the general European trend. This meant that the Bolshevik Revolution had to be welcomed as part of Western Europe's march towards socialism, and an important corollary, it had also to be criticized from the same international point of view. If seen in isolation, it was undoubtedly a piece of criminal folly. If seen in an international context, it was a harbinger of the socialist order to come. Yet in Rosa Luxemburg's view, the international socialist revolution was destined to arise out of the existing conditions of European capitalism in a spontaneous, organic way as part of a natural evolution, according to the determinist model elaborated by Engels and Kautsky. The task of bringing the new society about belonged to the working masses themselves. They would form the overwhelming majority of the population and would create the required new institutions in the course of their actions. Rosa Luxemburg had very sharply criticized the worship of organization by the German party bureaucracy, which the right wing had captured in the years immediately before 1914. Up to 1917, Luxemburg's polemical writings had been mainly directed against the worship of organization, but they were also no less prophetic of the future divergences between Luxemburg's conception of the socialist revolution and Bolshevik reality. Luxemburg's analysis of the position of German social democracy after August 1914 in the so-called Junius pamphlet of 1915, expressed Luxemburg's views very clearly. Quote, revolutions are not, quote, made, and great popular movements are not staged with technical tricks from the pockets of party leaders. It is only small circles of conspirators which can prepare a coup for one definite day, for one definite hour, and give their few dozen adherents the signal to start at the right moment. Whether great popular manifestations and mass actions actually take place is decided by economic, political, and psychological factors, the tension of class antagonisms, the degree of enlightenment, maturity, and militancy of the masses, which are absolutely incalculable and which no party can artificially generate. The historical moment demands the appropriate forces of the popular movement and creates new ones, improvises new methods hitherto unknown, scrutinizes and enriches the arsenal of the people, regardless of all the directives of any party. End quote. Rosa Luxemburg, Die Krise der Sozialdemokratie, originally published under the pseudonym Junius. Rosa Luxemburg never deviated for a moment from this conception of the revolution as an organic growth, basing itself on the masses who create their own institutions spontaneously. In 1906, Luxemburg had forecast that the forms of the proletarian revolution of the 20th century would be the spontaneous political mass strike in which the organized and unorganized masses would be welded together in one large fighting group. The October Revolution, however, proceeded along very different lines. It is true that Trotsky had tried to give the Bolshevik rising the character of a defense of the Soviets against counter-revolutionary adventures, and thus secure for it a broad popular base. But in reality, it had wholly followed the pattern of a Blancist conspiracy, with its characteristic Blancist emphasis on the decisive role of the capital city. No political mass strike, spontaneous or otherwise, had taken place, and the party which staged the coup won only about a quarter of the total vote after the coup had succeeded. If ever a revolution was, quote, made and, quote, staged by, quote, party leaders, it was the October Revolution in Russia. Rosa Luxemburg had welcomed the prospect of the advent of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia, but Luxemburg had always thought of it as taking the form of a seizure of power by the Soviets, which would represent the overwhelming majority of the population. Luxemburg had never tried to analyze the differences between the different socialist groups in Russia, and had never come to grips with the problem of a minority which would seize power by a Blancist coup and impose its political pattern on a backward country, still obviously unsuited for it. As Luxemburg had always conceived of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia in completely Western terms, Luxemburg's criticism of its results was in Western terms also. In September 1918, Luxemburg carried her attack to the premises on which the Bolshevik Revolution had been based. Quote, the implied premises of the dictatorship conception according to Lenin and Trotsky, end quote, Luxemburg argued, quote, is that the socialist revolution is a cause for which a ready-made recipe is available in the pocket of the Revolutionary Party, which is only to be realized with energy. This is not the case, end quote. Luxemburg. Die Russische Revolution. In 1906, Trotsky himself had thought in terms of the Engels-Kautsky-Luxemburg theory of historical determinism and had conceived his doctrine of permanent revolution within its framework. It had been a forecast of the future as it would shape itself by the action of the masses. But as he had himself gone out of his way to say, quote, we would be most pitiful subjectivists if we attempted as a political party to mold the future according to the pattern which had been outlined as a likely pattern of things to come, to force permanent revolutions down the throat of history. End quote. Yeah, this was exactly what had happened. Should be end quote, Trotsky. Yet this was exactly what had happened. Bolshevism had triumphed not as much as a result of action by the proletariat as such, but but as a minority movement which had presented the Congress of Soviets with a fait accompli. I always forget what that means. Fait accompli means a thing that has already happened or been decided before those affected hear about it, leaving them with no option but to accept it. Back to the text. Just as Blanqui had exalted revolutionary left-wing Paris as the true center of France, so Bolshevism had exalted Petrograd and Moscow as the centers of revolutionary Russia. Rosa Luxemburg, who still conceived the revolution as Trotsky had visualized the revolution in 1906, trenchantly denounced the results of a minority dictatorship established by a Blanquist coup d'etat, which was holding down the majority by force. As socialism was the movement for the masses, socialism was bound by socialism's very nature to be democratic. Luxemburg's Junius pamphlet of 1915, in which Luxemburg criticized the collaboration of German social democracy with German semi-absolutism during the state of siege, had emphasized the absolute need for liberty. Quote, "A politically mature nation," end quote, Luxemburg said, quote, "can no more do without political rights and unfettered public life, even if the deprivation is called temporary, quote, for the duration only," end quote, "than a living human being can do without breathing," end quote. Luxemburg. The Russische Revolution, the Russian Revolution, which again is on this channel. I don't know if that's been said before. It's kind of scattered because I recorded all the chapters separately, because if I didn't do that, it would be kind of a very long piece. But I should maybe, if I can, try to make it into a one piece. I think other people have read it on the internet too. I think, what's it? Adriesta's Revolt, or whatever that channel was, which is an inspiration for this channel. I think she or they recorded it. Where the hell am I? Luxemburg was therefore perfectly consistent when Luxemburg applied the same standards to victorious Bolshevism. From this stemmed Luxemburg's condemnation of the destruction of political liberty by the Bolsheviks, and Luxemburg's paeans of praise for democracy. Or, how do you say that, paeans? Full political freedom, tolerance, and unrestricted political rights for those who, quote, think differently from the party in power. Luxemburg's moving words exalting the freedom of the human spirit have been repeatedly quoted in the various polemical writings which have contrasted Luxemburg's approach with Lenin's. Yet they were written not by an orthodox follower of John Stuart Mill, but by a brilliant exponent of the secular messianism which had such influence before 1914. From Rosa Luxemburg's conception of the revolution, which differed completely from that of Lenin, arose Luxemburg's advocacy of the coexistence and mutual cooperation of a freely elected constituent assembly and the Soviets. The traditional forms of political democracy, which had developed in the West, would thus be supplemented by the Soviets, and collaboration between the two should prove fruitful. The idea of communism as the deadly enemy of parliamentarism and, quote, bourgeois democracy was invented by the Bolsheviks only after 1917. It had no place in the tradition of left-wing Marxism represented by Rosa Luxemburg. In a remarkable forecast made in 1907, Trotsky had anticipated this idea of the coexistence of Constituent Assembly and Soviets as a first phase of the future Russian Revolution, and even as late as February 1918, Trotsky could still treat Kerensky's delay in calling the Constituent Assembly as a contributory cause of the October coup, which had the summoning of the Assembly as one of its aims. I want to repeat that. The October coup, which had, Trotsky, in a remarkable forecast made in 1907, Trotsky had anticipated this idea of the coexistence of Constituent Assembly and Soviets as a first phase of the future Russian Revolution, and even as late as February 1918, he could still treat Kerensky's delay in calling the Constituent Assembly as a contributory cause of the October coup, which had the summoning of the Assembly as one of its aims. And that's why if you read Kautsky, to my understanding, well, I haven't read this part of Kautsky, so when I'm talking about secondary sources, I believe, if I'm remembering, Massimo Salvadori, who wrote one of the big fat biographies on Kautsky, Kautsky had pretty positive things to say, I think, about the October Revolution up until the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. And one of the reasons he supported the October Revolution up to that point is that he thought it would convene the October Revolution sooner. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I believe that to be the case. Quote, the November coup d'etat, end quote, Trotsky wrote, quote, may have been regarded as the salvation of the Constituent Assembly as well as of the revolution as a whole. And when we argued that the road to the Constituent Assembly nay not through Tseretelli's Provisional Parliament, but through the seizure of power by the Soviets, we were absolutely sincere, end quote. Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution to Brest-Litovsk. End footnote. The difference between Trotsky and Lenin in this respect was particularly pronounced. On the 14th of December 1917, Lenin said of the Constituent Assembly, quote, we are asked to call the Constituent Assembly as originally conceived. No thank you! Exclamation point. It was conceived against the people, and we carried out the rising to make certain that it will not be used against the people, end quote. Lenin. As cited in E.H. Carr, The Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 to 1923. End footnote. Rosa Luxemburg worked out in very moving words the probable consequences of the extinction of political liberty in all departments of public life. The Soviets would be atrophied and reduced to a shadow existence. Luxemburg applied to Russian conditions her German experience of the gradual capture of a mass organization of protest by a bureaucracy which had been moving to the right. This enabled her to forecast developments which only came to the fore long after her death, and have given her critical strictures the appearance of an anticipation of Stalinism. On the important question of democracy within the ruling party, Luxemburg proved to be right and Trotsky wrong. Luxemburg foresaw that unless the whole regime was fully democratic, democracy within the ruling party would also disappear. In this, Luxemburg differed from Trotsky and the opposition groups within Bolshevism, who mistakenly thought it possible to have a democratically run party ruling in a despotic manner. That's a key insight right there, right? And this is something that is important when talking about the left opposition, is that when they say workers' democracy, they mean democracy within the Bolshevik Party. They don't mean freedom to other working class parties. They don't mean that. That's not what they have. Trotsky doesn't come to the idea that there should be multiple parties operating in the Soviet Union other than the official Communist Party until the revolution betrayed. And he kind of, and even then, it's kind of, he kind of like backtracks on that. Especially when he says, like, all Soviet parties. So I guess I don't know who gets to decide. The question is left up to who gets to decide what is a Soviet party and what is not a Soviet party. They also they always made the point to insist that they were not a faction, and very much made a point of professing that they were against factionalism and upholding the ban on factions that was declared by Lenin in 1921 at the 10th Congress of the Bolshevik Party. Anyway, in this, Luxemburg differed from Trotsky and the opposition groups within Bolshevism and mistakenly thought it possible to have a democratically run party ruling in a despotic manner. Quote, public life gradually atrophies, end quote. Luxemburg wrote, quote, a few dozen party leaders, ... direct and rule, ... and an elite of the working class is called to meetings from time to time in order to applaud the speeches of the leaders, to adopt unanimously the resolutions submitted to them, end quote. Luxemburg bitterly criticized the Bolshevik policy of terrorism against their opponents. In 1906, Luxemburg had praised the mass strike, a political weapon created by the unorganized masses of Russia, as a method of making the fight for socialism and democracy more humane, and there was certainly no place for terrorism in Luxemburg's vision of the huge majority of the population fired by socialist idealism and sweeping all before it. After the collapse of the German monarchy, Luxemburg came to differentiate sharply between the Jacobins of 1793 and the German communists of 1918. Quote, in all bourgeois revolutions, bloodshed, terrorism, and political murder have always been weapons in the hands of the rising classes. But the proletarian revolution needs no terrorism to gain. The proletarian revolution's ends, and the proletarian revolution's supporters abominate murder. The proletarian revolution needs none of these weapons because the proletarian revolution fights institutions, not individuals. The proletarian revolution is not the desperate attempt of a minority to shape the world by violence according to its own ideals. It is the action of the overwhelming majority of the working people called upon to fulfill its historic mission to make historical necessity into historical reality. One second. One second. I want to copy that quote down. Sorry about that. And that quote is from Rosa Luxemburg, published in Rotafana, 14th of December, 1918. Quoted by Paul Frulich in the book Rosa Luxemburg. I have a piece about Paul Frulich on this channel. I should really listen to it because I don't remember much of it. End footnote. With equal force, Luxemburg attacked the new Bolshevik authoritarianism, particularly the dictatorial position allowed to factory managers after the initial experiment of workers' control. Luxemburg considered absolute political freedom to be the sine qua non of a thorough re-education of the masses who have been degraded by centuries of class rule. Quote, social instincts instead of selfish instincts, mass initiative instead of apathy, end quote. Luxemburg. These, in Luxemburg's opinion, would be the results of unlimited political liberty and freedom of public opinion of the school of public life. Since Rosa Luxemburg saw the Russian Revolution as an integral part of the general trends inherent in European capitalism, Luxemburg deliberately underplayed the difficulties faced by a minority despotically imposing an advanced Western pattern on a backward country. Luxemburg never came to grips with the question of what would have happened if the Bolsheviks had taken her advice after the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and had organized new elections in the middle of the Brest-Litovsk crisis. A Bolshevik defeat in the elections would have been certain. But should the Bolsheviks have accepted it and abdicated? Rosa Luxemburg never put this question. Instead, Luxemburg based her interpretation of Bolshevism's shortcomings solely on Bolshevism's isolation. The problem of the transition to socialism could not be solved on a national scale. This explained everything. The triumph of the revolution in one country only was bound to falsify its character. In 1915, Rosa Luxemburg had unhesitatingly classified Russia together with England, France, Belgium, Germany, and Italy, as one of the leading group of traditional capitalist countries whose working classes would have the task of serving as vanguard to the masses of 5 continents. The fact that Russia alone among this group had broken out of the capitalist ring condemned the Russian Revolution to be a caricature of the real thing. Rosa Luxemburg never pointed out that Russia also happened to be the most backward country in the group. What mattered to Luxemburg was Russia's isolation, not Russia's backwardness. The conditions under which the Bolshevik Revolution had taken place, such as the war, Imperial Germany's superior military strength, and the complete failure of other working classes to come to Russia's aid by successful mass actions against their own governments and against the war, all made it inevitable that what the revolution had achieved was not real democracy and socialism, but only distorted imitations of them. Rosa Luxemburg's criticism implied that the German social democratic charge that Bolshevik rule was a sorry caricature of the dictatorship of the proletariat was perfectly justified. But Luxemburg also made it clear that she considered the attitude of German social democracy since the 4th of August 1914 to have been an equally sorry caricature of the policy of the socialist class struggle. Socialism was possible only on an internationalist basis. There is plenty of evidence that Rosa Luxemburg's mind was profoundly disturbed. Her writings had a pessimistic undercurrent as well as an apocalyptic confidence in the future. When comparing the Bolshevik Revolution with the June days of 1848 in France, Luxemburg emphasized that the European working class took decades to learn the lessons of the June days. Quote, "The phenomenon is repeated today," end quote, Luxemburg wrote. This can only mean that at the end of September 1918, she still envisaged the possibility of a German victory in the war and the resultant collapse of Bolshevism, as the June insurrection of 1848 had collapsed. The lessons of a short-lived Bolshevik revolution would have to be learnt in the decades to come by the working class of Western Europe. In an article of September 1918, headed "The Russian Tragedy," Luxemburg even discussed the possibility of a morally compromising Lenin-Ludendorff alliance, followed by the liquidation of Bolshevism by the victorious Germans. What was important was that the, quote, "caricature of the proletarian dictatorship," end quote, forced on Bolshevik Russia by unfavorable circumstances should not be accepted as a model for the West European socialist movement. Luxemburg clearly saw that the mere existence of Bolshevik Russia would be a powerful influence in the reshaping of this movement. "The awakening of the revolutionary energy of the German working class," she wrote, "cannot be conjured up by mass suggestion, by blind faith in an immaculate authority, be it the Social Democratic Party bureaucracy or be it the, quote, Russian example," end quote, end quote. Luxemburg, The Russian Revolution. This coupling of Bolshevism and the German party bureaucracy, which Luxemburg looked on as the main source of evil in the labor movement, shows the degree of critical detachment with which she had now come to view Bolshevism. No more uncomplimentary parallel could possibly have been conceived. In a further passage about the Bolsheviks, Luxemburg commented, quote, "The danger begins when, ... the Bolsheviks establish the tactics forced on them by disastrous conditions as a basis for a new general theory, and recommend this to the international proletariat as a model to imitate, ... The Bolsheviks render international socialism a poor service. When the Bolsheviks want to import into the intellectual arsenal of the international proletariat all the distortions forced on them by the emergency in Russia, and proclaim these distortions as the new revolutionary wisdom. In the long run, these distortions are nothing but the reflections of the bankruptcy of international socialism in the war," end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. The Russian Revolution. At the end of the war, A few weeks after Rosa Luxemburg had drafted her critique of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Bolsheviks urged the establishment of a third communist international, which they thought to be long overdue. Rosa Luxemburg was horrified. Rosa Luxemburg saw that, as long as West European communism consisted of a collection of small groups of revolutionary propagandists, and so long as no new large organizations had been created spontaneously by political mass strikes, the new international would be dominated by a party whose, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, was nothing but a caricature. Its, quote, distortions would be taken as a model, and the results would be disastrous. Luxemburg's emissary to Moscow had strict instructions to vote against the establishment of a new international. Footnote. C. H. Eberlein, The Foundations of the Comintern and the Spartacus Bund. Communist International, Volume 6, numbers 9 to 10, London, April 1929. End footnote. New section, Section 3. Rosa Luxemburg's tragic assassination on the 15th of January 1919 during the troubles of the German Revolution made Luxemburg a prominent figure in communist martyrology, but the movement to whose growth the profound impact of Luxemburg's death contributed so much was to follow the path which she warned against in October 1918. For some years, communist tradition emphasized the ideas that Luxemburg held in common with Bolshevism. Footnote. Important in this connection are the discussion of Rosa Luxemburg's views by communist writers in 1922 after the posthumous appearance of her essay. And footnote. I didn't even read the footnote. Oh yeah, I did read the footnote, excuse me. End footnote. Both the advent of the thoroughgoing theory of socialism in one country and of revolution from above, the champion of the spontaneous action of the masses, the hater of party bureaucracy, and the exponent of the internationalist character of socialism gradually came to be regarded as the bearer of an evil tradition of heresy. Orthodox Bolshevism developed further and further away from the democratic humanitarian traditions of pre-1914 European socialism, while Trotsky, after a long Leninist phase, slowly returned to a position closer to that which he held before 1917. Thus, it was not surprising that when the old controversies of 1903 to 1906 were revived in 1931, they should have shown the old alignments. Stalin launched an all-out attack on Rosa Luxemburg's wrong-headedness, while Trotsky, who was now in exile in Turkey, vigorously defended the memory of the first prominent convert to his theory of permanent revolution. Stalin put forward the astounding suggestion that it was Rosa Luxemburg who had originated the theory, and that Trotsky had merely borrowed the theory of permanent revolution from Luxemburg. Trotsky had no difficulty in refuting this misstatement, and though he dissociated himself from Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the October Revolution, Trotsky made a spirited attack on the trend towards making Lenin's infallibility into a dogma. One example will indicate the profound change which has taken place in the German Communist Party's attitude towards its founder. Since the days when the Spartacus letters circulated in Imperial Germany during the First World War, they have twice been reprinted in volume form. The first occasion was in 1920 under the auspices of the German Communist Party. The second occasion was in 1958 under the auspices of the East German Socialist Unity Party. The editor of the 1958 edition takes it as axiomatic that whenever differences arose between Rosa Luxemburg and Bolshevism, Lenin was always right. By contrast, the anonymous editor of the 1920 edition, who was obviously a prominent comrade in arms of Rosa Luxemburg, went out of his way to say, quote, "The publication of the collection of Spartacus letters also refutes the idiotic accusations according to which the German Communist Party do nothing but ape the Russian example in a completely slavish manner, while affirming its faith in the Soviet system and the dictatorship of the proletariat from the spring of 1917 onward. After all, the core of the ideology of the proletarian revolution, Spartacus has all the same not refrained from criticizing the policy of Bolshevism. The politics of a socialist party are not the private property of this particular national party, but a matter of deep concern to the whole working class of all countries, end quote. And that quote is from, I guess, Spartacus itself. Spartacus Briefe. Rosa Luxemburg's essay of September 1918 still retains its significance among the writings which illustrate the profound differences between even the most radical exponents of the traditional Engels-Kautsky synthesis of Marxism on the one hand, and the Bolsheviks on the other. Though fragmentary and unfinished, it has been more frequently reprinted and translated into other languages since 1939 than any of her remaining works. Not surprisingly, the development of Soviet society since 1917 has enhanced its interest and importance. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.